So that's great. So I'm doing that type of research, but I'm also doing oral histories, and I have been doing oral histories since I did my master's degree 15 years ago. So I've interviewed people that lived as part of the commune, and I'm interviewing people who lived in the village, and I'm trying to piece together the relationship that developed and took place during that relatively brief period of time. So Will, if you want to advance the slide. There we go, that's me. If any of you would love, or like even, to be interviewed, if you have stories to tell, I have my card, that's my phone number. I can't really read the email for some reason, but I do have a card, so please come up to me afterwards. The last time I did this, I was able to set up interviews afterwards, and they were great. So Al Rosenblatt was here, so I was able to interview him, and Noel Tepper, who was Timothy Leary's attorney. So I got them together after 50 years. They were on both sides of the issue at Marist, and recorded an interview with them. So they were both very gracious and had amazing stories to tell. So if you have any stories or interests, please let me know. Will, if you want to advance. So, like I said, the interesting story to me is the relationship between the village itself and the commune. So, in 1963, this actually was a letter to the editor from Leary and Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner, who were the three principals of the commune, just thanking Millbrook for its gracious welcoming of them. It's a brief little letter saying how happy they are to be here. Kind of talks about what they were doing at the time. They were doing research. So what we're seeing is an example of a relationship that was began as very cordial and benign. And as we'll see over time, things changed for a variety of reasons, I think. Most of them understandable reasons as time moved on, but initially the relationship between the group and the town and the village was seemed extremely cordial. So Will, if we can advance. With Leary, and there's Leary on the right, and the gentleman with glasses is Richard Alpert. When they moved here, the press kind of came with them. So they were infamous even at this time. They had both been expelled from Harvard, essentially. Richard Alpert was actually fired. Leary just didn't have his contract renewed. He was a lecturer. It's popular belief that he was fired, but he really wasn't fired. He just stopped going to class. So they said, no, we're not going to renew your contract. But anyway, they were the Richard Alpert story at Harvard was actually much more interesting because he was the first professor fired from Harvard since, I'm blanking, one of the transcendentalists was, I'm blanking on who it was.
Emerson?
May have been Emerson. For the divinity school speech, he was actually expelled from Harvard. So I think it was Emerson, but don't quote me on that. But anyway, Richard Alpert was fired, and so when they came to Millbrook, they were already known. The press had written articles about them. Esquire had done an in-depth kind of expose on them. They had left Harvard and originally tried to establish a commune or some sort of group in Mexico, which didn't last. But there was press that followed them to Mexico, and there was articles written about them. So they ended up in Millbrook, and of course the press followed them here. So this is a Millbrook Roundtable from December of 1963, and that's Leary and Alpert at the diner over here, being interviewed by the New York Times. And others were interviewed by the New York Times, as we come to find out as well. So if you want to advance. So this was the result of that, was the New York Times article from December 15th, 1963, talking about the group moving to Millbrook, and quoting some residents of Millbrook, including John Kading, who, do you remember what you said? Let me see if I can quote it directly. So John said, John Kading, owner of the corner news store, the center of the small shopping section, said, "You can't meet finer people." He said he had not heard his customers speak one solitary word against the men. So, again, there's the story is that there's this interesting group, and I think part of the story is at the same time the group was very small at this time. There was only about 12 to 15 kind of permanent residents in 1963. It fluctuated, but they kind of kept to themselves. They were relatively clean cut, as you can see in these photos. I mean, they're wearing suits and ties and stuff like that. That didn't last long. But they were very much, academics. That's what they were. They were both PhDs. They were both Ivy League types. Richard Alpert got his PhD at Stanford and taught at Harvard. Leary got his at Berkeley, taught at Harvard. If you want to advance it. This is just a funny article, or it's not even an article, it's a little blurb that was in the round table a few days after that came out, saying that, let's see, this is about the New York Times article, and it says, "Copies, as far as we know, are still being passed around. Edward Mangiacomo and John Kading, both of whom were quoted by the Times reporter, appear to have the piece pretty well memorized by now. Look to us as if I'm not sure what that story. That's the story. Did a good job of examining the village, by the way. So they made a bit of a splash. Go ahead, advance. In 1964, so this was we're talking the fall, winter of '63 now. Summer of 1964, there's a new round of major press stories. This was in Newsweek. There were other articles in the New York Times, Life magazine, things like that, national prominent publications like that, talking about Leary and Alpert and Millbrook. And specifically, in 1964, the group decides that they're going to open their doors and start allowing people to come in on the weekends to pay to stay on the estate as a psychedelic retreat without using psychedelics. So it's really an interesting story because a lot of what they were doing was happening at the same time at the Esalen Institute, which still exists in California in Big Sur. And I just did a pretty in-depth chapter and/or article on comparing the two groups to each other. And it's really fascinating because the same people, they influenced, the Esalen Institute literally influenced the Millbrook group, and the same exact people, Aldous Huxley being one of them. Aldous Huxley happened to be at MIT while Leary was at Harvard, and the two of them became very close during that time. So anyway, that's an aside, but these weekend retreats start gaining more attention. There's obviously more people coming through town, I would imagine. Sometimes on the weekend they would have 50 people. I've seen that number. So you start there starts to be a change in the size of the group, the goings on, and also the publicity. The publicity is increasing, and it comes to a major kind of eruption by the end of 1965. So the weekend retreats are happening throughout 64 and 65. They're also doing things, the group itself, at this time calling itself the Castalia Foundation, was doing live events in New York City, a variety of theaters in New York City, where they would do like light shows and multimedia type events, which were written up in the New York Times. Again, the publicity was kind of always there So one thing Leary was good at was publicity, good or bad. This is bad publicity. So in 1965, Leary gets arrested. An interesting story, him and his girlfriend and daughter and somebody else from the group were trying to go to Mexico for vacation, and they got stopped at the Mexican border in Laredo and sent back across the Texas border, and that's where they were essentially arrested for possession of marijuana. He received a 30-year sentence for that, for less than an ounce of marijuana in 1965, a 30-year sentence and a $30,000 fine. But obviously, again, we're talking about the publicity explodes. Now you're seeing Leary portrayed essentially always negatively now. Initially in the press, it was kind of, yeah, they got thrown out of Harvard and, they're doing some weird things, but they're not criminals. LSD was legal at the time, all of these things. But in 1965, it very much changes. And we'll see throughout 1966, 67, there was direct results of that. So one of the first things that happened was the mansion was raided, the estate was raided by the law enforcement, Sheriff Quinlan, District Attorney Heilman, Assistant District Attorney G. Gordon Liddy, also Al Rosenblatt was involved in that, and they had had the estate under surveillance for quite some time before this happened in April of 1966. But they began, and this was the beginning of a series of kind of police engagements with the group. So they raided the mansion. They never found any LSD, which is interesting, but I'm not sure they knew what they were looking for at the time, quite frankly. The other thing was the group was very adept at hiding it. But they did find marijuana, but no one was there were people were charged in this raid, but nothing stuck because there was just it wasn't done by the book, I would say, as far as the search and seizure of things. So, but you start seeing this increased negative media perception, increased size of the group, increased activity of the group. Leary always waving his hand and on TV and in the newspapers, becoming more and more kind of out there, but also more and more confrontational with the media, which I think resulted in, obviously there's a concern among the people that lived in the village that illegal things were happening on the estate, possibly, but also the image of the town and the village, I should say, was very much entwined at this point with Leary. So so you start seeing the Poughkeepsie Journal weighs in 1966. LSD threat is a frightening one. Again, the media is, and this is happening nationally too. There's a turn in 1966 in the national media against psychedelics and LSD as being, something that has some sort of useful potential, perhaps, into something that is bad and should be outlawed and is dangerous, and rightfully so in some examples. I mean, things were happening that were dangerous, and so you start seeing that here with the Poughkeepsie Journal. Well, another example of Leary's kind of being elevated into the popular culture. Robert F. Kennedy planned a Senate inquiry into LSD, and one of the guest speakers was Leary. So again, Leary was everywhere, including Washington. Next slide. There he is, happily giving testimony in Washington on LSD. So you see the conflict, June 1966, Leary becomes even more confrontational. He writes a diatribe under this heading, systematic harassment. He writes a diatribe to the Round Table saying how his rights have been violated and ACLU is going to become involved. And again, more confrontational, more kind of in your face, so to speak. Will. Then he starts his own religion. He did this for legal reasons. He was trying to follow the 1964 case that allowed peyote to be used by the Native American Church. So this was all embroiled in his, it was part of his fantasy too, that he was some sort of guru, but it was also part of his legal defense. Because you got to remember, he's fighting the marijuana conviction from 1965. He actually fought that all the way to the Supreme Court, and won, by the way. Again, more examples of now TV's interested in Timothy Leary, but not only Timothy Leary, it's Timothy Leary and Millbrook, Leary, LSD, drugs. So you're seeing that, and this is, again, nationally, but also local. Go ahead, Will. So you see a group formed in town, anti-LSD group, that really is villagers were scared, and rightfully so. I think that there was crime perhaps taking place, and a lot of negative publicity and the negative media was happening nationally, and obviously happening here as well. This is one of my favorite cartoons. This is Glenn Van Bramer cartoon from 1967. You put Millbrook on the map, right? Why can't you be happy? National magazines, TV, LSD, drugs, Millbrook, crazy Leary. Van Bramer was actually pretty outspoken about some of the mishandling that he perceived by law enforcement, especially I know John will be able to tell us about this, but the roadblocks that took place in 1967, they set up roadblocks around the estate, and they basically pulled everyone over and handed out tickets for anything, broken taillight, and that caused some consternation, as you can imagine. They're really fascinating thing about this is, obviously, we should know this, but the feelings within the village obviously weren't uniform one way or the other. It wasn't all anti-Leary or pro-Leary. There was a conflict within the village itself. So there's a conflict between the group and the village, but there's also this kind of localized conflict, as well as we see with some of these editorials. Look at this handsome gentleman in the bottom right. That's you, John. There's John Kading in the bottom right, 1967 article. We see the difference between the 63 New York Times article and the 67th, 4 years later. Obviously, it's a drug cult now. They're not researchers. They're a drug cult, and the town, the village, I keep saying town, the village is much more concerned about what's happening. Although John still says they're nice people, and so John is still on their side. But and you can see you can make out the face that they painted on the mansion. That's Salvador Dali. So go ahead, Will. Even the Poughkeepsie Journal, which had been generally anti-Leary, there was an editorial. This is a specific reaction to another raid that happened in 1967, in which Leary's son, Jack, was arrested, and I don't think they ever found anything on him. I don't know why he was actually arrested, but he was taken to the jail, and they cut his hair, and that caused consternation among, even the Poughkeepsie Journal said that the sheriff had overstepped his bounds, because the kid was never charged for anything. They made him get a haircut. And in 1968, Leary and the group moved. Essentially, the estate was closed to them. At that point, there was continued police raids, continued negative media attention. Leary was also spending a lot of time in California, wasn't really here that much by 1968. So there was certainly pressure to move on, and that's what happened in 1968. And so if we want, I would like to ask John some questions and see where we go from there, and then you're free to ask us questions. Okay?
Careful how you answer them.
Come on up. Have a seat.
Well, good evening, everybody. I just want to start, if I would, in order to bring it all up to date. In 1947, I graduated from high school. Oh, is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. In 1947, I graduated from high school, and I bought the corner news store, and that's where it all starts. It started in 1963, is when Timothy Leary moved into Millbrook. In 1965, I got a new accountant, my father-in-law. Set me up in the books. So consequently, I started a book in 1965, and I kept track every day of happenings in Millbrook. And I can remember Timothy Leary, when it first came out, I enjoyed your talk on the newspapers, because we had enough of them. And the crazy thing is, with all these newspaper articles that you have today, somewhere in all my boxes and collections, I have those newspapers because they were available, plus many of the articles, the magazine that were written up on Timothy Leary. I imagine there must be about 15 or 20 of those magazines all stacked up in boxes somewhere. But anyway, that's the way it started. But the interesting thing is, when I was doing this, Timothy Leary came in 1967, 66, and I asked him what his aim was. And he was talking about basically going to the county jail or the state jails and getting these criminals or things to go under sedation. I'm using LSD or something. And that was his aim. And I said, what to do? You know, to change the minds of all these criminals that we have. But that was the thing, and I always thought it was a good idea. But I got carried away within the organization. But anyway, in 1964, 65, I can remember it was getting bigger, just like you were saying. It was 50 people, maybe 75. And they were all coming in from the city, the guys. And I can remember the ambulance car, which we just bought a brand new ambulance Cadillac. And I would happen to be one of the drivers or one of the people to get the calls and to go pick up somebody's in La La Land. We got to take them to that hospital. And that was the early days of LSD. But the best one I want to tell you is when I had the corner news, I had a fence that was going right along the side of the road, and then I had the garage, and I had strings going down, and I had morning glories all in bloom along that fence. And then I built a stairway going upstairs on the outside, new entrance with a lattice. So I played more Glory along there. And I'll never forget the day the guy came into the store and he says, "Are you the owner of this?" "Yeah." He says, "Can I have the morning glory seeds that are falling out of the..." And I said, "Sure you can." In fact, I didn't think, but I didn't know until maybe 2-3 months later, I'm reading an article, and LSD, morning glory seeds were was the main ingredient. Boy, did I. That was crazy. But that's the way it always turns out.
So,
In these books, only thing I have in there, I have Timothy Leary. I talked to Timothy Leary this morning for just a little note. That's all it said. And then I go through and then all again. And then I got another one back in 1967. There was an article in there where he was taken down here to the county court, the town court, and for and handcuffs.
Yeah. You have a
And that
picture of
was
that
the
somewhere.
interesting. I got the picture of
Yeah.
that.
I'll get it.
Which I treasure.
Wow.
But anyway.
so let me ask you a question.
Yes,
So you are in both of the New York Times articles,
yes.
the 1963 one and the 1967, and there's your, that's
Oh,
you.
yes.
So you seem to be on the side of, I don't know, not necessarily the side of Leary, but the side of, they treat us decently, they're good people, they act nice, let's not burn down storm the gates. So my question to you is why weren't you as concerned as some of the other people in the village as far as wanting them gone?
I think truthfully, having talked to Leary directly, he used to come in every morning when he was here to get his New York Times. And then or some way or another, I would mention the fact there's an article on you in my magazine, or Life magazine. And, "Oh yeah, give me that." So I sold some magazines. He was a good customer, yeah. But that's the way it worked. Because I honest to God, Johnny Flanagan we had a meeting last Wednesday. And honest to God, John Flanagan, I feel so bad that he's not here tonight to talk about his experience with things. But if I can tell one little story about it, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Well,
Mike is
anyway,
yours.
he was a reporter, sports reporter for the Poughkeepsie Journal. And he went into his office, and one of the guys in there said, "Hey, do you know that Timothy Leary's getting married today at the house here?" "Oh, it is? Well, we gotta get somebody up there." And Johnny says, "Well, I suppose I could go." And he got somebody else to do the sports or something. But he went. He got there and he met Glenn Van Bramer. Glenn's the greatest guy. He was a good reporter for the Millbrook Roundtable. And honest to God, they got together and they were talking and so forth. And then all of a sudden, here comes Larry with his new bride coming down the aisle. And they're shaking hands with everybody, and they get to Johnny Flanagan. And she looks at Johnny Flanagan and says, get out of here. You've been writing up all this terrible stuff about Timothy and me. There's no wedding unless you get out of here. And by God, he says, if that's the way you feel, fine. So he turns the camera over to Glenn Bramer, and Glenn has a pencil, and he writes up the whole thing. Gives the camera back to Johnny Thing, and Johnny Fagan puts it all in the Poughkeepsie Journal. But that was his thing. But the thing that got me, John was telling me that this is last Wednesday, he was saying that Timothy Leary really backed him up. He says, told his wife to be, he says, you can't, he's just doing his job. Oh, no. There's no wedding unless he's out of here. And that was the end of that story, but that's the way he was. He was a kind soul. I know the boy, Jack, and his sister. They went to school to Millbrook. And I saw him quite often.
How are we doing on time?
Yeah, we got time. Yeah, lots of time.
Okay. Should we open it up for questions, or
Yeah.
are there any questions right now? I see.
What brought them here? What brought him here?
What brought him here? I'll
Timothy?
tell you what brought him here. The Hitchcock family. The Hitchcock family bought Diedrich Estate. And they were in the meat business and raising meat. And they had the big mansion, which you saw pictures of.
Big house.
And that really was the appetite to bring to thing. And they made a deal with Hitchcock to come and live there. But the summers, like he said, in 1965, 66, that's when the groups used to come in. And that's when we had the ambulance calls to come. Because we had to come these kids and take them into Vassar
Yeah, I
Hospital.
just want to say, I must have been 10 years old in '66. I remember because we were 1 year in Mechanicsville. We had to go by the gatehouse to get to the store because he made me start working at 10 years old. So, anyways, the teepees, are you familiar with that? Is that the 66, 67?
Yeah,
All along Route 44?
yeah, that would have been, I think, the summer or spring of 1967.
Okay.
But they may have done it more than that. But yeah, they shut down the big house and they decided they were going to live in teepees, and
I
which
remember
was
saying, and I remember saying, Dad, you're never gonna live in one like that. You're not gonna ever do that.
yeah. So yeah, and John's right. You know, it was Peggy Hitchcock specifically knew Leary and invited them to come down to the estate. They were essentially homeless. They'd been thrown out of Harvard. They tried Mexico. They got thrown out of Mexico. They tried the Caribbean. They got thrown out of the Caribbean. So they were wandering around New England trying to figure out where do they go next. And she said, well, my brothers own this estate in Millbrook. And it was Richard Alpert that came down because he was a pilot, so he had an airplane and flew down with Peggy Hitchcock in 1963 and looked it over and said, of course, this will be perfect. So there was another gentleman.
Richard Albert, did he become Ram Dass?
Yes.
He is from, yeah.
Yep.
And
He,
Omega, because Elizabeth Lesser at Omega is good friends with
Oh.
him too. So you go to the Ramdas Library in Omega Institute.
And I'd just like to say one thing about his store. I grew up in Poughkeepsie. I was born in 1952. My grandfather had a farm, Arthur Hammond, on Hammond Road, which is now Wing Road and Hammond Road.
Yeah.
And my dad would put me on a bus in Poughkeepsie, and my grandfather would meet me at your store. The bus would let us off there, and my grandpa would pick me up, so it's kind of neat to see you. It was fond memories.
As I understand, John, Bennett was thriving in those days, Bennett College. And I was wondering I never hear anyone talking about the relationship between Bennett College and Leary. And was there any?
There was never, no.
Not anything at all?
No.
That's hard to believe.
You know, the interesting thing is, with all the kids coming in from New York and the thing, very, very seldom you ever saw them in the town walking or whatever. But during the summer, believe it or not, just outside of the big mansion, there's a big open field. And I can remember, I think back in '66, maybe it's '67, they had teepees, tents, all scattered around there, all living in those tents. They had water brought in, and the whole thing, and they were all bivouac, as we call it in the Army, bivouac.
Can I just,
So first of all, with Ramdas, yes, I've interviewed him, and I interviewed him about 10 years ago. He's still alive. He lives in Maui. He's not well. He's had a stroke, but memory is there. The speech is a little difficult, but he gave me a couple hours of time over the phone.
That must have been interesting.
Yeah, he's a fascinating guy in a lot of different ways, but his memory of Millbrook is clear and sharp, and he remembers those days and was very very good to me. As far as Bennett goes, I just want to read from John's second New York Times interview. So this is not directly a quote, but this is from the June 14th, 1967. Leary drug cult stirs Millbrook. So the first paragraph, I'm just going to read. At the beginning of each school term, the students at Bennett College, a junior college for women here, are treated to a slideshow featuring close-ups and pictures of Dr. Timothy Leary walking in the village. Fraternizing with this man, the students are warned, will mean expulsion. It is a measure of how seriously the people of Millbrook are beginning to view the mysterious activities of their controversial neighbor. It will be 4 years in August since the silver-haired, jet-jawed Timothy Leary moved the headquarters of this psychedelic drug cult to a large private estate a mile outside of town. And then later on in the article, they must have asked Leary about the children and the youth of Millbrook. He says, politically, it just would not make any sense for me to turn on the kids of this community. So, and then they interviewed some students, Paul Galley being one of them, who was 18 years old at the time. And he said, we don't bother with him and he doesn't interest us. So, but Bennett College had made them off limits. They actually did that before 1967. So I'm assuming that caused more people to actually want to go on the estate. If they had said nothing, there would probably wouldn't have been much interest. Any other? This one here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have two questions. Is there any reliable estimates on how many people ultimately made their way through the commune over the years it was established?
Well, they didn't keep, very, very good records on that. He does have material in his archive that, as John said, in 1964 specifically, and in parts of 65, they would get 50 or more people on the weekends in the summer. So you're talking a few hundred at the very least. I think more, not more importantly, but as equally important is the types of people that went through there who were essentially famous or went on to become famous, like the Grateful Dead and Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and Allen Ginsberg, and so they were, because of the access to New York City, there was a constant influx of musicians and writers and kind of the counterculture. I mean, my argument is, and what my overarching work is that the counterculture, as it becomes known in the 60s at least, the 60s counterculture, as we think of as the Haight-Ashbury in California and all that, really started here. This predates all of that by years, by 3 or 4 years.
And that was really part of my follow-up, was it, so people came here mostly through word of mouth, like how did?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, they would go on, even going back to the days when they were at Harvard. It's actually how they met the Hitchcocks to begin with, or Peggy Hitchcock to begin with, was Leary and Alpert would spend time in New York City quite a bit. They had come in contact with Allen Ginsberg in 1961. He actually came to Harvard and took part in their research experiments. So he took psilocybin, which is a mushroom derivative, magic mushroom, and they developed a friendship, him and Leary and Alpert. And so he would invite them to come to New York City and go to parties and things that he was involved in. And so it was really through Allen Ginsberg that they met Peggy Hitchcock, they met Charles Mingus, who spent time here, Maynard Ferguson, who lived here, Alan Watts, Ken Kesey went to Ginsberg's apartment before he came up here on the famous 1964 trip. With the Merry Prankster. So it was, a lot of it was because of Ginsberg. He was able to introduce Leary, who at the time at Harvard was an academic, wasn't hanging out with beats and jazz musicians and that kind of stuff at that point. But because of Ginsberg, he meets the New York City crowd, really, and started that process even before they came here. And then when they come here, it's just so much closer, you know, they can get down to the city all the time. They actually had, later on in their time here, they had changed their name. They were originally called IFIF, the International Federation for Internal Freedom. And then they changed the name to the Castalia Foundation, and then they became the League for Spiritual Discovery, so LSD. And by the time they were the League for Spiritual Discovery in 1966-67, they actually opened an office in New York City, and were like recruiting people to come up and you know, go to the weekend retreats and stuff like that. And they were also handing out. They published a journal. They were constantly, you know, writing books and things like that. So.
Did they make money from the people?
They did. I don't know that they ever really covered their costs, though. They weren't really good with money, shockingly. But they did charge people. Yeah, that was part of the thing. And in one of these articles, it talks about Leary. At the time, he was doing, and he was like constantly lecturing. That's why he really wasn't around that much, you know, comparatively, because he was always out giving lectures and talks, and he would get $1,000 an appearance, basically, which pretty good money in 19.
Yeah.
But when you think about, you know, that's kind of supporting this whole group. I mean, I know they were living on this estate and everything, but I've never seen evidence that that the Hitchcocks were like paying the bills for them. I think that was very much why they did the weekend retreats and the appearances in the theaters in New York. They charged admission.
Did they ever publish their results of their experiments?
Yes, they did. Leary published dozens of academic articles and.
Because recently, within the past few years, there's research that LSD for people with Alzheimer's, it helps and so on.
Yeah.
And I wondered if he did anything on that.
I want to add to that. I can remember him coming in one day to the store, and he says to me, he says, "John, we need somebody to type. We need a couple typers. Because we do these experiments, and you know, we write them all up and how they react and everything." So anyway, the interesting thing is, I mentioned it to my sister, and says, "Yes, I remember him coming up and asking me to type up these reports. They were all on one paper after another, different names and so forth." And my sister Helen, "Yes, he did it for me." Well,
6 or 8 months.
different report.
It wasn't long.
Have you ever researched it?
Yeah, actually, the reports are in his archive in New York City. There's boxes of them.
Your type.
They're pretty, they're standard psychology reports. So they were doing various experiments going back to Harvard. One of the things that they were trying to do was, as John noted, was they actually had a thing called the prison experiment in the Concord prison experiment in 1962, which is where they were in maximum security prison in Massachusetts, giving psychedelics to prisoners, and then doing a study on recidivism rates for these people. And they published that, and that was groundbreaking at the time. Turns out
Right.
it wasn't exactly true. Well, it wasn't that it wasn't true, it was that they were offering their house in Massachusetts as kind of a halfway house for the prisoners who had taken the psychedelics. So they had like this level of support that the other prisoners didn't have, so it kind of skews, your research when, you're helping them find a job and you're giving them a place to live, and the other prisoners are just kind of, at the time, especially in 1962, prisoners, there wasn't a lot of programs for them. They were just kind of released and then go, deal with yourself. So, but no, those reports are, they were also doing, they got weirder as time went on. They were doing, they created a thing called the Experiential Typewriter, which was, because what they found out was, makes sense, which other researchers at the time didn't seem to take into account, but if you give somebody these powerful mental drugs and then ask them a bunch of questions, it's hard for people to give correct answers or give answers of what they're experiencing even. It's hard to come up with the words. So they invented this big typewriter thing that had symbols instead of, so you'd have a symbol for scared, or because they thought the mind was racing faster than the words could. So they were doing, but then Ram Dass told me they were doing other experiments too. They were trying to, they tried a thing called the group mind, which is where they would take psychedelics and then try to read each other's minds, things like that. So it got a little strange, but the thing about Leary, and I'll give him credit for, is he kept records of everything, even as time went on and things got stranger. He did require people to do reports, even in 66, 67, when that was part of the deal. If you were up there and you were taking drugs, you got to write up a report about it. So, but yeah, they're all available. Most of them are anonymous. They don't have names attached to them. Some do, but they're all available at the next gentleman here.
It seems to me that this group was as notorious as Studio 54 was later on,
Yes.
with everybody agog at what was going on. But no real harm was done, just a lot of nonsense, really.
Yeah. I think John Flanagan made the point repeatedly last week that there were a lot of rumors going on of what was going on up there, but nobody really knew because there wasn't a lot of people going back and forth. And he, I think, made the point that there was rumors abounding about all these horrible things that were happening up there, but in reality they weren't really happening. So it was more of a. But you're right. For its time, I mean, as we've seen, and this is the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I could have showed hours worth of footage, and the CBC came down and did a show, like an hour-long program here on the estate, which I have, which is really interesting.
But not too far away, about 3.5 hours away, you had Allen Ginsberg with a very successful farm.
Yes.
It's still there, and he's spoken of most kindly in the valley
Yes.
of Cherry Valley.
Cherry Valley. Yep. Interesting.
Very warmly he's spoken of,
Yeah.
and his farm is still there,
Yeah, and that's an interesting.
not too far away.
Not far away, and you know, the Esalen Institute is still there, and is a world-class kind of you know, spa type place in Big Sur, and it started around the exact same time that within months earlier than Leary coming here, and some of the original ideas were the same. You dive into what they were, the weekend retreats, and they were giving lectures, and they were doing yoga at a time when like nobody even knew what yoga was. They were growing macrobiotic food, which at a time when no one really even knew what that was. They were doing some things, and you had this kind of bi-coastal relationship between them and Esalen that was really interesting, and kind of cross-pollination. But why did Esalen survive? People were doing drugs there too, same time. My argument and the work I've done on this is that Esalen pretty quickly by 1964 had gotten rid of the drugs. Or at least they told people, don't bring drugs in here.
If they descended today, in this situation, how would it progress, do you think?
If that, today, after, well, it's hard to say. I mean,
Take that scenario
yeah,
and bring it here today.
yeah. Well,
How would it have gone on?
it's hard to say because you can't, if you take Timothy Leary out of the equation of the history of psychedelics, it's totally different. I mean, it was really a result of him being who he was and being here and doing some of the things he did, and eventually, you know, involving law enforcement and so on, that the FDA categorizes psychedelics as a Schedule I narcotic now. And for 40 years, there was no research done. It's changed within the last 10 years.
But we had the opioid crisis here,
Yeah,
and meths.
yeah.
The drugs have always been very running through the area,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
certainly in upstate New York.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, it's interesting because so much of the research that's come out in the last 10 years, there's been a real re-evaluation of psychedelics specifically. And I would wager, just looking at where the research is going, that within, I don't know, who knows, you know, you can't tell the future, but I would imagine that they're going to eventually become decategorized. I don't think they're going to become legal, like marijuana will eventually, but I do think that they will be utilized for research and for certain psychological situations. Like they use it for PTSD with people. They're doing research on people who are extreme alcoholics. And that research came out in the 50s.
But more carefully monitored.
Right, exactly. Not what Leary was doing. This is like medical research. And unfortunately, you know, Leary is to blame, and Leary, and not just him, but Leary and others in the 60s are to blame for the prohibition. I think they were careless. And, you know, but it's hard to say how things would be different if they fell out of the sky now. I don't think, you know, even though the research is coming back, I don't think it's ever going to be allowable to just do in your state somewhere.
Where did you say all the records were in his reports?
New York Public Library.
New York Public Library.
Yeah, they bought the Leary for years. The Leary collection was
The
in
main
some.
one.
Yeah, the big one, the Swartz.
The one with all the steps.
Yeah, yeah, with the lions. Yeah.
Mine.
Fourth floor, I think. Anyway, the archive for years was in somebody's garage in California. For years, you couldn't get to it. I tried, you know, a decade and a half ago, and you had to go through a guy named Michael Horowitz, who is Winona Ryder's father. Anyone knows who Winona Ryder is? Anyway, he was Leary's main archivist, but you had to go through him. It was in a garage in California, and eventually, I think in 2007-ish, 2008, the public library bought it. It went up for auction, and they bought it. And it's great for me. you know, I don't have to go to California and wrangle with somebody. So yeah, and they processed it, and it's there. It's a big collection, and you know, they chose to go down the road of archival, and we have an archivist here, so he can answer for this. But they've chosen to, and I dealt with archives that are this way too. They've chosen to keep it in the order in which Leary had things. So it's extremely discombobulated, as you can imagine, over his whole life. Plus, you're dealing with Timothy Leary, so things are not exactly A to B. So if things say Millbrook on them, they could be from Millbrook or from somewhere else. And so it's a bit of a slog going through it, because you sit down and you get, you know, boxes of stuff that you think are Millbrook, and half of it's not, you know, but that's the way it is. But the reports are all together. They separated those out. So, but it's a great resource, not only for me doing this specific project, but just anybody doing anything on the 60s, because Leary was one of those people that was just the center of a lot of going on beyond when he left here. I mean, I kind of stopped, you know, my story ends the day they move, essentially, but there's this whole other story that goes on in California, and he goes to jail, he gets broken out of prison, the weatherman, he flees the country, goes to Algeria, on and on and on, you know. So, and that's all in there. It's his whole life. So it's really interesting. Yes, sir.
Was there much of the guests that came? Was there much? Did they use the service of the village and town? Much interaction, or did they tend to keep to themselves?
I'm gonna ask John to answer that, because I don't know.
They pretty much kept to themselves, believe me. Because having that in the store, you know, busy, but very, very seldom I ever saw anybody. I'm talking about just people that came. They went through the village and parked the car, got on a teepee, and and that was their weekend. Yeah.
I was wondering a very practical thing with the village. If there were 50 odd people up there in teepees or in the mansion, did they bring, where did they buy their food? Did Verona's flourish while they
I don't know.
I didn't hear.
She said, where did they buy their groceries and things like that?
They go to
They usually brought them with them from the city.
They go
And they were, I know, they used to come in groups,
was there too.
in 4 or 5, you know,
Daddy,
in a
Grand
car.
Union was there then.
What?
Grand Union, IGA was there. And the Veronas, was there 3 at that
It was
66?
Grand Union was still there.
Grand Union, you hear that? Grand Union was in 66.
What'd you think?
Grand Union?
Yeah, Grand Union was still,
In
did
66.
very well.
I just wondered if they
Yeah.
got a financial benefit over these years, which would have been positive,
Right.
or did they run up debts
Yeah.
and disappear?
Yeah, well, I think by the end, they had, I think it was more that along those lines. They were, yeah, I don't know with the local stores or anything, but I know that they were, you know, they left the mansion in disrepair and had,
Broken windows.
yeah, it was pretty much trashed. I spoke with John Foreman, who used to live there, and he was gracious years ago, at least 10, 12 years, 13 years ago, whatever it was, to invite me up there and take me on a tour of the house itself. And, you know, he had done a lot of work, but he had stories. Of course, he wasn't there in the 60s, but he had stories of what it looked like when they left, you know, and housekeeping wasn't big on there.
They didn't know how I will tell you this, as an ambulance driver going up there, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. I'm gonna be 91 next week. And then my mind, every once in a while, it takes a little while for things to sink in. And remember, we're going back 65 years now to the old Braden thing.
You're doing
But I
good, Dad.
remember going into the big house, the mansion, and honest to God, it smelled like urine. Thing. And they used to urine in the corner and stuff. And that's the way it was. I don't know how many times we went in there and we could smell the uncleanliness. The bathrooms weren't used.
I just wondered, I think it might have been vomiting during your trips too? Was that a possibility? It could be.
It's possible. I think they were, you know, certainly by the end, they were, they had lost control of who was there and coming and going. And, yeah, I've read that other accounts, you know, about, you know, and it was pretty common among these groups, I think, in the 60s. Like, everybody wanted to join a commune, but nobody wanted to do the dishes type of thing. So that was, you know, unfortunately, they were, you know, that wasn't what they were thinking about. And any other? That's awesome. Yes, sir.
Well, I was hoping John would elaborate on the, when I talked to you last March, you said one of the biggest problems with the locals was when Sheriff Quinlan did the roadblocks.
Oh,
And you told me
yes.
that was the biggest consternation with the locals. I was wondering if you'd talk about that just a little bit.
Thank you for reminding me.
Thank you.
You want to talk about it?
That's what I was looking forward to hearing tonight.
Well, the roadblock was put up because they used to, it's right on, as you make the corner, up here at the corner,
44A.
first place you see, that's the big Ginsberg estate there. And that's where they had the roadblock.
What was the reason for the
The
roadblock?
reason was drugs. They wanted to see if anybody had any drugs going through and then going into the Diedrich estate.
So did they
And
were they able to differentiate
There was
between,
no drugs. And that's a big thing about all the time I remember that they had roadblocks, they had an examination of all the places and everything else, but they never got any real concrete things to arrest him on. And that's the big, that was the big problem. The lot never put any fame on him.
No, not here. He was never, I think he was arrested for passing a bad check. But he personally
It
was
wasn't my
not.
place.
No, no. But he, you know, again, he had the Laredo bust, and he got arrested in California after that, and that's how he ended up in prison initially. But the roadblocks, you know, reading the papers from the time, that caused a lot of anger, I think.
And yes, that was one of the bad parts of him being here. But they had those roadblocks and they had to open the trunks and all this thing, and everybody was, but they did, eventually, a lot of the drivers, they got to Washington Hollow, they turned right and went up the Shunpike. You know, the Shunpike is the old thing, huh?
Or
They call it the
343, they could go around, right?
And then you just bypass all that.
Well, the worst part is that Quinlan was doing this, because I grew up in Dutchess County, Quinlan was doing this without probable cause, I'm assuming, so he was breaking the rules. And being a sophomore at Poughkeepsie High School, we had a really progressive history class.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the haircut of his son. That was gigantic, because in the 60s, your hair represented where you were going with the movement. As your hair got longer and longer. And when you cut someone's hair like that, we had talks on it for many, many discussions in the history class about breaking the law of cutting, or taking his rights away, his son.
Yeah, and, you know, frankly, I think that's one reason why none of the charges ever stuck was because some of the ways they were going about this, was like, for example, the first raid in April of 1966, they made all of the women strip search all of the women, none of the men. And they had the unfortunate, for them at least, that one of the women was actually a journalist up from McCall's magazine, and she was interviewing Susan Leary, and just happened to be there, stayed the night. Her name is Myra Manis, and she became pretty famous. And so she wrote about this in in McCall's and talking about how she was a pretty straight person, a generation older. She's more Leary's age. He was in his 40s at this point, and she was around that age. But she described the night. They're sitting around listening to music. Everyone goes to bed. Next thing you know, there's banging on the door and all of this. And it doesn't paint the law enforcement in a very good light. And I think that was a lot of the reason that the charges never stuck with him. Is and then of course the roadblocks really just angered the locals.
Was the roadblock organized by the police? Was the policeman there?
Yes, yeah, it was a
Yes, it was
sheriff's office.
State police.
Yes, sir.
I was a student in junior high school, and Timothy Leary. I was a student at junior high school in Boston. And Timothy Leary came and gave us a talk about what was going on from his point of view. And the impression I got, and remember that I'm a junior high school kid and wasn't very sophisticated, but my feeling was that he was talking off his feelings and not from his brain. That things were talked, he talked over things, like he would make a big deal out of something that didn't seem like a big deal. So maybe he was caught up in
Yeah.
the movement.
Yeah, I think, well, I know for a fact that, Leary's a very complicated character in many ways. And he's really hard to pin down. So as a historian, you don't want to psychoanalyze people too much, but it's kind of hard not to with him. There were some pretty obvious character flaws and character traits with him. But yeah, I've heard people say that, definitely. There remains kind of a two sides to him. There's people who, within seconds could figure out, well, this guy's a shyster, he's a used car salesman, whatever. And there were other people that I talked to, even now, 50 years later, who think the guy was walked on water, and it's really an interest. It's really, there's like no middle ground with him, which is really, really interesting to me. But he embellished for sure, definitely. And he was caught up in his own kind of narcissism in a lot of ways. He had a lifelong problem with authority that went back to his youth, and it really was the reason for so much of his turmoil, I think, was his own inability to handle authority. I mean, he was thrown out of every institution he was a part of other than Berkeley, really. He went to West Point, was discharged from West Point, thrown out of the University of Alabama, on and on. So,
Who's the modern day equivalent?
Timothy Leary? Oh boy, I don't know. There's a lot of people, there's this kind of, like we've talked about, the research. But the people that are doing the research, the legitimate scientists, would never want to be associated with Timothy Leary. I've spoken to a couple of them, and they don't even want to talk about him.
Dr. Strangelove.
Yeah, yeah. But there are people who are kind of on the fringe, who are kind of, see themselves as the next Timothy Leary. Terrence McKenna, if you know that name, he's passed away, but he was kind of the next Timothy Leary, but then he ended up with cancer and died, unfortunately.
And who watches them?
Who watches? I don't know what that means. Like, who
There's
watches?
no supervision?
I'm sure the police are watching. No, the FDA, for the research, the FDA they very carefully manage that.
Devin has to drive back to Albany tonight, so we don't want to keep him too late.
But I will, if anyone is interested in talking and being recorded, has stories to tell, please let me know. I'd love to come back with my recording equipment like I did with John. I just want to thank John so much. Not only for tonight, but last week, Tim and John Flanagan gave me probably 2 hours or close to it of their time and memory, so
I just feel so bad that Flanagan's not here tonight. Because last Wednesday when I was there, honest to God, he went after one story after another with Timothy Leary and White.
So this was part 2 of the program, so maybe we need a part 3 next year.
If we have another one of these, I'll go through and see if I can find some of the old books and stuff that I got collected. Because I got quite a few stuff.
There is a book called Millbrook, though, it's at the library, right?
Yeah.
It's all about the Timothy Leary, which I wish it was on sound recording, I'd put it on for my father in a second.
Yes.
So, but I don't know if I gave him the book, that if he would actually read
Yeah,
it.
that was written by a guy named Art Klepps.
Okay, is it pretty, have you?
Oh yeah, I have it, yeah. It's, Art Klepps was part of the group, he lived on the estate. He was wild even for them. And Timothy Leary said he was a bit of a BSer, and that's coming from like the main BSer. So I take it with a grain of salt, but there's a lot of value in it, definitely. I mean, that's one person's story.
You read it and you tell your brother about it.
Yes.
Do you remember what he said about Poughkeepsie?
Klepps? No.
Yeah. It's in one of the later chapters. He introduces the readers to Poughkeepsie.
Okay.
And, excuse my French, he calls it that it was Native American for place of overflowing shitholes.
I do remember that, yeah. Yeah, he had very colorful language, very, what's that? He called, Art Klepps called,
Art Klepps wrote the book Millbrook. The title was called Millbrook.
Millbrook Library.
He was a member of, he actually had his own group called the Neo-American Church. And he's a really interesting character. But anyway, his group kind of melted into Leary's group in 66, 67. And he wrote the book.
What he said about Poughkeepsie?
Oh, he said it's Native American for overflowing shitholes. Which is, I mean, Art Klepps is from Syracuse, so he doesn't have really a lot to talk about. All right, thank you so much.